Hi, I'm Nikki Lowe, and welcome to the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show, where I share insights and interviews that support women to combine their family, work, and life in a more successful and sustainable way. In today's episode, I'm going to be exploring a topic that affects each and every one of us as mothers, but you may not be aware of it. Just like fish aren't aware that they swim in water, as mothers, we aren't aware that we're literally soaking in this stuff. When I first discovered today's guest, I was blown away by her insights. She speaks to the experience of being a mother in a way I'd not heard before. And after listening to her insights, I felt a powerful shift in how I experience my role as a mother and as a career-driven woman. So I'm honoured that she's joining me today to share her work with you. My guest is Dr Sophie Brock, a Motherhood Studies Sociologist and mother living in Sydney, Australia. She provides analysis of motherhood in our culture, exploring the ways individual experience of mothers are shaped by broader social constructs. Sophie supports professionals, business owners and creatives in revolutionising what motherhood means in our society and how individual mothers are supported and understood. Sophie's offerings include a self-study course for mothers and practitioners, her podcast, The Good Enough Mother, and her Motherhood Studies Practitioner Certification Programme. And Dr. Sophie Brock's powerful and at times painful experience postpartum led her to use her expertise and voice to help other women to understand their value and worth and cultivate resilience, enabling them to feel empowered in their lives, particularly in their mothering, when it's often unrecognised and devalued within society. I know you're going to love what Sophie has got to share. She takes some pretty complex theories and really condenses them down into some simple but profound ways in which we can understand our model for motherhood and motherhood sociology. I won't keep you any longer. Let's dive in and welcome Dr. Sophie Brock. So welcome, Dr. Sophie. Thank you for joining me on the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show.
Thank you for having me, Nikki. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
And all the way from Australia too, so I appreciate you accommodating the time zone difference.
No problems. The brilliance of technology, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I came across your work probably a couple of years ago now, and it was part of my journey, really. I ended up burning out after I had my first child nearly 9 years ago now, and as part of that recovery, I started to get fiercely curious over what had caused my burnout, because partly I'm somebody that just loves to consume knowledge and information, but a big part of it was, if I couldn't understand what had led to it, how could I stop it ever happening again? And to begin with, that journey of discovery went to, like, what did I do wrong? What should I have been doing more of, less of? Like, how could I prevent this as an individual? And soon I kind of got into the realms of the systemic piece around this about, it's not just me. And that is where I think I discovered your work about kind of the cultural and society view of motherhood. And I'd love to start with your story. If you could share with us the journey that you've been on and what led you to do this work.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for sharing part of your journey, Nikki. And it's one that is, a story of so many women and especially mothers in our society and culture today. And so what led me to this work isn't actually my own motherhood journey, as I know it often is for many who enter into the realm of wanting to work with mothers and the area of maternal support. I started out doing my bachelor's degree and I majored in sociology. I've always had a fascination with women's stories, and particularly at the time, early on, I had an interest in journaling, actually, and diary writing of women. And it turned out a lot of the research I was doing around that had to do with mothers. So I've kind of had this interest in mothers and motherhood and the inner lives of mothers since I was in high school, was when that started. And then through my degree, I came across the research by Professor Andrew O'Reilly, who founded Motherhood Studies. That led me down the rabbit hole of exploring motherhood studies as a discipline. I then went on to do equivalent to a master's and then a PhD, focusing on mothers who have children with additional needs or disabilities or who are disabled, and focusing on their experience of motherhood, their sense of identity, and their experience of relationships. And so that's how I kind of came to this work, which was well before I became a mother myself. And then I finished a PhD and I graduated right after my daughter was born. I graduated. I was awarded the PhD just before I gave birth to my daughter. And so then, and then I started my business about 2 years later. So that's been my journey to this space.
Okay, so you fell pregnant towards the end of your PhD and then you submitted your thesis. So it wasn't actually your motherhood journey that necessarily influenced the beginning of this journey, but I imagine it's gone on to have an influence on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting exploring that dynamic because I think regardless of whatever it is that we're studying or researching or passionate about, I think that our experience as mothers and our experience in relationships more broadly influence our work in various ways, even though we might like to say that we're objective and that we're these clean slates that aren't impacted by anything else other than our professional hats. My view of the world as a social scientist is that actually we've got a lot of interrelations and interconnections in all the different realms of our experience. And so absolutely becoming a mother has really hugely shaped and influenced my work. But I also think that it's important for the purposes of the type of work I'm trying to put out into the world is to make a little bit of a distinction there, because I think a lot of the time it's assumed that we're only interested in talking about motherhood as a social construct, or we're only interested in talking about how important it is to research and be interested in the experiences of mothers because we're mothers ourselves, or because we know mothers, or because we need to support mothers in order to support children. And so I think actually making a bit of a distinction there to say that motherhood, the experiences of mothers, is an area of scholarly interest, of academic inquiry, of research focus, of public discussion, of cultural focus, not just because we're mothers ourselves, but because actually we're a part of the human population, a big part of the human population that is deserving and worthy of our own focus and interest for our own sake as human beings. So I think it's both, right, in terms of responding to your question about what kind of launched me into this space. I would hope that people beyond just mothers themselves would be interested in the support and the inner lives of mothers, because we're so influential to so many different parts of our social world and our society and community.
I love that you've said that, and I think that's really, really important. So when in this journey did you decide to share your model of the social construction of motherhood?
Yeah, I as part of my PhD research, one of the key findings that came out of that was the development of a theoretical concept. And in the context of the academic world, that's called hegemonic maternality, which is basically the hegemony of motherhood. Hegemony is a theory that's not mine. It's originally by somebody called Gramsci, and not to go kind of down that route in this part of our conversation, because it will probably bore your listeners. But in a simple way, it was a theory to describe how motherhood is not only socially constructed in our society, but how the shoulds of motherhood are enacted and how they're felt by mothers. And so in the process of translating some of that research and of building my business and saying, okay, how can I take what I have done theoretically in my research and actually bring it out to a wider population, make this research and these ideas accessible? How could they be useful to mothers? I had a membership at the time. It was called Liberated Motherhood, and that was a place where I would speak to mothers every week and deliver different workshop topics on things like, where does mum guilt come from? How do we work through that? Anger, what does that look like as mothers? Where are all these expectations coming from? How do we navigate them? We'd have a whole bunch of different topics. And in one of the workshops, I was attempting to describe, I think it was around guilt or the pressures of motherhood and where they came from. And I made reference to my theory from my PhD, and just on the fly, it was a Facebook Live workshop, I came up with this analogy of, think of it like a fish tank. And it kind of, my model of the fish tank of motherhood kind of developed from there. So it's really an analogy that is an adaptation of the research that came out of my PhD.
So I hadn't realised that you'd kind of on the fly use that kind of metaphor and analogy, and that's what kind of gave birth to this. So
yes.
Can you share with my listeners that model, please? Because it's such a powerful one.
Yeah, sure. So if everybody could imagine in their minds just a round glass fish tank. We know on the surface this sounds like it has nothing to do with motherhood, but bear with me. So you imagine this round glass fish tank, and what this fish tank represents is our society. And so the reason I'm introducing this visual is because when we talk about society and culture, it can feel quite intangible and it can be really hard to understand what we actually are talking about. So if we imagine this glass fish tank, that's the world that we live within. That's the social world we live within. We're the fish inside of that. So the fish inside are the mothers, actually all people, but for the purposes of this analogy, we're the mothers inside this glass fish tank that represents our social world that has certain rules around what it means to be a mum. So if you imagine I get out a big black texter and I start writing on the glass of the tank a whole bunch of shoulds and rules around what being a perfect mum means, what being the good mum means, what being the super mum means. And we have things written up there such as, she has endless patience. She wanted to become a mother. She became a mother easefully. She bounced back to her pre-baby body after she had a baby. She's the primary carer of her baby. She spends all of her time with her baby. We could spend the whole podcast episode talking about the perfect mother myth, but there's a whole list of expectations that go along with what it means to be the perfect mum. And the tricky thing about these rules is that when we're the fish inside that tank, we might think that we could just look up and look outside of the tank and see all the rules written on there. And if we want to get curious, sometimes we can. If we sit down really intentionally and go, I'm going to really analyze all of the conversations that are going on around me. I'm going to really analyze the social media feed that I'm given. I'm going to really analyze the media and the advertising that I've been exposed to. I'm going to really think about the comments that are made to me in my workplace. If we were really to hone in our lens, which is what I'm trying to do through these conversations, we would start to see this play out everywhere. But so far, when we're not aware of how society and culture operates, when we're not aware of how motherhood is socially constructed, we've actually taken on these rules as part of our socialization. So we start being we're swimming through this water, right, of our culture in this tank, and we're breathing in, so to speak, all of these rules around what it means to be a mum from when we're little children ourselves. So this is part of why I try to use this fish tank analogy to bring in a visual to say we're living within a tank that has particular rules and we've breathed them in without even knowing it.
Yeah, I love that. And I imagine there are levels of granularity that sit within that fish tank, because I'm just thinking in my own head, decades ago, we didn't have the social media or necessarily the global news feed that we have today. So it would have probably been your country of origin and your family of origin that would have influenced a lot of that fish tank. But fast forward to kind of present day, and I'm imagining it's a lot more complex than that now because you've got kind of global influences.
Yes, it is. I mean, it's still influenced by our culture, by our historical time period. And so we could go back, for example, and the rules that are written on that fish tank and how it's constructed change according to culture, change according to historical period as well. So if you go back to your mother's or your grandmother's or your great-grandmother's generation, the tank looked different for them. So there were different rules in place. If you were to go to a different culture, for example, in African-American culture, when you talk about motherhood and what it means to be a mother, there are very different definitions than the ones that I've just shared with you, which are based on a really Western, patriarchal, very individualistic idea of what it means to be the ideal mother. So whilst these shoulds are really pervasive around our globe. They're not unchanging. They're not always the same. And an important thing to note here is that in that fish tank, there are different obstacles in the way of, for some of us, fish or mothers. So some of us may be in a position within the tank where actually we have a whole bunch of like seaweed and coral in our way that makes it really hard to swim, that makes it really hard to move and to mother in a way that feels empowering and feels like we have choice because, for example, the tank isn't set up to support us. Our children may have a disability or additional needs. We may have disability or live with disability or additional needs. We may be from a low socioeconomic background, right? We may not have as much privilege as another person. We may be a single mother. There are a whole bunch of ways in which we're positioned in a particular way within the tank. That means that for some, they will be able to swim more easily through it. The tank is built for them and to support them in their movement in easier ways than it is for other mothers. And so whilst we may be living within the same society, we may be living within the same culture of motherhood, how that actually ends up impacting us as individual mothers really varies.
Yeah. So I'm imagining there's a foundational phase to this, which is just becoming aware of your fish tank. And as you say, what are the obstacles or supporting factors in there? What do you then support your kind of community and clients with? So there's this level of awareness, and then what happens next?
Yeah, so I'd say the level of awareness is a piece to linger at for a little while, because what can start to happen when we first bring in this is that, first off, it's a whole new way often. It's a whole new way of thinking about ourselves and the world around us. And so it can be a little bit much to get your head around at first, if that's, feeling a bit discombobulating for any of your listeners who may be kind of just absorbing this for the first time, that it can feel a little bit difficult to sit with initially. And so allowing yourself a bit of time and space to explore what it actually means that, how I think about myself has been shaped by a whole bunch of factors that maybe I'm not aware of, or how I judge myself is about more than just me and my family. The uncomfortable thing is that when we're within this tank, we feel all of the rules, we feel the judgment, we feel the expectations. We place them on ourselves, but we also place them on other people, sometimes unknowingly. That's how this structure continues to operate. So I think coming back to 3 distinctions that I make that I think can be useful for people when first coming to this is to know the differences between the words mother, mothering, and motherhood. And so motherhood, that's the fish tank, right? That's the tank itself. That's the society. That's the culture. The mothering is the verb. It's the doing. So in the fish tank, it's the swimming. It's the breastfeeding your baby, changing your baby's nappy, preparing the bottles. It's the bathing your baby and looking after them and your child, right? We take it, I think a lot of the time we focus on, I don't know what the demographic of your audience is, Nikki, but most of the women I speak to are in early phases of motherhood. But I think it's important to say this extends well beyond that, right? Mothering continues and continues and continues. And so the mothering is the verb. It's the doing part of what it means to be a mother. And then the mother is the social role or the individual, the identity. So the mother is the fish, the mothering is the swimming, and the motherhood is the tank. And just exploring and sitting with those definitions and thinking about how that could look for your own experience is kind of where I sit with for a while. And then the next step, I suppose, to answer your question is to pull apart the differences between our individual values and what we want in our lives, what is appropriate for our lived experiences and circumstances and context. So where are we in the tank? What resources and support do we have access to or don't have access to? And what's actually meaningful to us, right? So that's on the one hand, versus what are all of those shoulds that I've internalized? What are all of those rules that I've taken on from the tank up until now unknowingly? And so it's a process, but that's the kind of first place that we start.
And I'm imagining if somebody's coming to your work for the first time, Sophie, this is pretty mind-blowing. It's like, fish don't even know that they're swimming in water. And so there's this recognition to begin with, as you say, of, okay, what's going on for me isn't just my own experience. But I love the actual model that you create about these three levels or layers or distinctions about the motherhood, the mothering, and the mother herself. I think that is such a powerful lens to think through our experience.
Yeah. And look, I also think it's important to say that this work isn't actually that new. I mean, the lens that I've put on it here in terms of the fish tank and the development of my model, yeah, sure, like that's new theoretical work, but it's drawn from a whole body of maternal research and literature that has been around for decades. That distinction between motherhood and mothering was originally made by Adrienne Rich back in the 1970s in her book Of Woman Born. Mothering as an Act was by Sarah Ruddick in 1989. I mean, there's a whole bunch of maternal theorists that actually it's their legacy that they've left and the work that women have been doing for decades in this space. And, there has been a level of frustration for those who work in this realm to go, we need this work to get out more broadly. This actually needs to be part of our cultural language and understanding. And so absolutely, when we first come to it and we first hear it, it can feel like okay, what does this mean? Some of us may actually have resistance to it and not want to know, but they probably wouldn't have got as far as this part of the podcast. But I think that it can be reassuring to know that if you are feeling this sense of this feels big and what does this mean for me in my life, that there's a huge legacy of work that has been done leading us up to this point, and that we're not alone in this. We all go through this in various ways.
Brilliant. I've heard you say on your own podcast that your lived experience informs your research and your research informs your lived experience, that they're kind of intertwined. And I'm really curious about how your work has informed you as a mother, but also the other roles that you occupy in your life.
Yeah, I think that, I'm a qualitative researcher, and the basis of my work was drawn from social constructionism, which is basically that, we kind of co-create our lived experience and our relationships and our world. And kind of, as I was referring to at the start of our conversation, that there is an intermingling. I also think, though, that it can be, and depending on what discipline we're working within, it is necessary to draw some boundaries there as well, because otherwise you can kind of get lost in the where am I? Where is my work? And particularly when we're working with participants and we're working with other mothers, I think it is really important to have quite clear boundaries there. So I guess I'm saying two things here, which I think actually complement each other rather than are contradictory, but recognizing all of the ways that we are actually imbued within our work and the way that our work informs us. And naming that and being really clear about that and exploring that, I think is much more beneficial for our work and for our lived experience, rather than pretending that there isn't any intermingling there to begin with. And especially, I'm working in the field of motherhood support, and I'm a mother myself. So of course, right, there's going to be crossover there, and my experience informing my work and vice versa. In terms of how that can look, in terms of my own personal experience of mothering, it looks like I am very aware of the cultural messages that I'm being given about what it means to be a mother. So another analogy I use is kind of like a radio signal. So we have these signals coming in at us all of the time with all of these messages, from conversations we have with our child's teacher, conversation you may have with your partner, to advertising that you get on the TV or through your social media, or a way a question is written in a form that you're filling out for a hospital visit. I mean, there are ways that this is built in every part of our lives. And so because that radio signal for me has been really dialed up in intensity, I'm able to quite quickly and easily pick it up. Not always, of course, but it means that I just have a greater literacy, I suppose, around the messages that I'm being given. And as a consequence of that, I feel very little guilt in my motherhood that isn't constructive. So motherhood and guilt are seen as these kind of synonymous things. And I recognize that part of what has been built into what it means to be a good mum means she feels guilty. Because if we're constantly feeling guilty, it's proof. It's like our guilt trophy. it's proof that I'm trying really hard, but I'm never actually able to live up to it. I'm never able to be enough or do enough. We know this inherently, right? But so when I say something like, I don't really feel much guilt in motherhood, that can be quite jarring to hear, because what it could equate with is, well, you mustn't be a very good mother then, because you're not trying to live up to the same standards that I am. So it's complicated, right? But that's an example of how my work has informed my mothering, and an example of the way my mothering's informed my work is looking at how important it is to recognize that the relationship between a mother and herself is impacted by all of the other relationships in her life. So we can't think ultimately, and others would disagree, but I don't think we can think about the self without thinking about the relationship that the self has with others, the way that those other relationships and those other contextual factors shape her experience of herself and the world. And so that's been something my daughter has taught me around expectations that we place on children unknowingly as part of perfect mothering, and my own contextual experience of being a single mother and recognizing that actually how you are positioned in terms of your relationship can really shape how others perceive you. So that would be an example of how it's worked the other way as well.
Those are two really powerful insights. And I'm wondering, for you said something really interesting about actually your experience of guilt is probably different to many mothers, in that you've kind of learned about these radio messages and been able to kind of objectively look at them. So what was coming to my mind as you were saying that is almost like it's not that you don't get those messages, but they almost like fall at your feet, and you're able to look at them hopefully objectively, but I imagine it's not as clean as that, before deciding what stuff you want to take on or not. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, if we can think about it, because the most powerful way that we experience judgment is through self-judgment rather than judgment from others. Like, yes, we can experience that really explicitly, but I think for most mothers, we have a level of consciousness where if we're fed a particular message that we don't agree with, we're like, well, I'll take it or leave it. I'll leave that one. Thank you. It doesn't sit with me. So how it plays out generally is that it's not as clean cut as that, but that actually we take on those messages, as I said earlier, through our own experience of socialization, through witnessing how we've been mothered and thinking, I want to do it just like that. How will I ever live up to this version of my mother that I've created? Or I'm going to be the complete opposite. How do I be a mother that is the opposite of what I've experienced? It comes about in all sorts of ways. And so we unknowingly often actually have taken on those expectations and embedded them as part of our values. So in terms of how I've been able to navigate and don't particularly feel much guilt in motherhood, isn't necessarily because I'm better at buffering the messages that come at me, but because I've been through that process of untangling the messages I've already received and have gone, okay, what is here for me and what is really useful for me to feel in terms of guilt? Because I don't think we should aim to get rid of mum guilt. It can be really important in keeping us aligned with our values. And so I've just had more practice really at that process of untangling what are my values and what are the shoulds that I've internalized. And I think that that's something that, a lot of mothers, that's a really accessible way that we actually can start to move through our socialization, is by looking at where we're experiencing guilt and just interrogating that guilt a little further.
Brilliant. And I am completely aligned with that. What's the functional guilt here and what's the dysfunctional guilt and where does that come from? And, I've had to go through a process of that myself, and it's an ongoing process through every stage of motherhood and, every life experience. So how does the social construct of motherhood impact women? And this is the lens that I suppose my audience and particularly I'm curious about, is where work and motherhood collide and those systems and what happens. So how does the social construct of motherhood impact women who either have to or choose to work outside the home? What's your perspective on that kind of care and career conundrum?
Yeah, so yeah, what you've just mentioned, the care career conundrum, is a concept I developed to try and encapsulate some of that juxtaposition, because in many ways we have been set up to live and work and mother within a system that holds us with competing demands. So the demands of what it means to be the ideal worker and the demands of what it means to be the ideal mother are often literally opposite to each other. So we have, with the care career conundrum, you think of two circles overlapping each other. The mother is in the center. So we're kind of often caught between these two competing worlds and ideologies. And on the one hand, we have care, which represents the perfect mother myth. So all of the things around, she's self-sacrificial, she puts others first, she's selfless, she always gives to others, she doesn't think about herself, she's not selfish. She is always putting her children before everything else in her life, including work. And then we have on the other side with work, we're expected to work in a way that invisibilizes our children. We're expected to work in a way that pretends that we don't have caring responsibilities or that apologizes for having caring responsibilities. We're expected to be these independent, self-sufficient, pull yourself up, work as hard as you can, and you'll get where you want to be. A sense of it's all on our shoulders. It's an individualized responsibility. And so, speaking broadly, career equals individualism, care equals interdependence. And so we're actually literally stuck between and pulled between these two competing ideologies. And our workplace is built on the career side of things, and all of the realm of motherhood and the expectations that come with that is built on the care side of things. And to make it even harder for us, right, in order to be the perfect mothers, we are expected to have a career. We are expected to engage in work. And, I'm using air quotes here, contribute to the family financially. And, our worth and our value is equated with a dollar amount, how much we're earning. And so I think that mothers are inevitably caught, basically. We often have very little agency and not a whole heap of movement when it comes to trying to navigate these two competing realms.
Brilliant. And I think that's so powerfully put. So if there was just one thing that you hope somebody who's listening to this takes away, given that we've covered so much, and I'm sure that, there's a whole more load of information that people I'm sure will want, but if there was just one thing, what would you want that to be?
I would want mothers to know that it's not their fault. They're not alone in this, that they are enough, and maybe they weren't meant to be enough for the system that we're living in. So we're enough or not, according to what, according to who, and to start to recognize your place of agency, your place of power, your place of choice within the context that you find yourself, and to know that little steps that we can take in our daily lives when it comes to recognizing, naming what we want, naming our values, finishing that cup of tea before tending to somebody else, voicing our needs, setting boundaries, knowing that you and your needs are important and that you as a person matter, not just because you're so important in fulfilling the needs of everybody else. That you're valuable, you're worthy just as you are, without needing to do or be anything else. And so that's, I guess, a take-home message that I would love to be able to share and for mothers to be able to receive.
Oh, Sophie, I noticed my shoulders drop in relaxation, and also just sitting up a little bit straighter in terms of feeling more empowered by your words. So I think that was really powerful. So I'm sure people are going to want to find out more about you and your work if they don't already. So where would you point people to? And I'll put all of these in the show notes as well, so they've got the links.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad that it felt that way for you in terms of a relaxing of your shoulders, because I recognize that sometimes this can feel like a lot and we don't need more on our plate to do. And so just taking things as easily as we can and knowing that we're doing the best with where we find ourselves. So if people would like to connect with my work further, I've also got a podcast. It's called The Good Enough Mother. So you can find me on there, on social media, Dr. Sophie Brock, on Instagram and Facebook. My website, the same, drsophiebrock.com. I have some self-study courses for mums on there. And I also run a certification program for professionals, practitioners who work with mums to be trained in all of this type of maternal theory so that we can hopefully take the ripple effects out there more broadly and create shifts in mothers' lives and hopefully work to change what that fish tank of motherhood looks like for future generations.
And thank you for the work that you're putting out into the world, Sophie. It's so important, and the ripple effects I can only imagine in people's lives. So thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. I appreciate it.
If you've enjoyed this episode of Wisdom for Working Mums, please share it on social media and with your friends and family. I'd love to connect with you too. So if you head over to wisdomforworkingmums.co.uk, you'll find a link on how to do this. And if you love the show and really want to support it, please go to iTunes, write a review and subscribe. You'll be helping another working mum find this resource too. Thanks so much for listening.